Hello and welcome. I'm Tom Palmer. Tonight we're speaking about the Noetic sciences. With me is Dr. Cassandra Vieten, the Director of Research for the Institute of the Noetic Sciences. Dr. Vieten, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
So tell us about the Institute of Noetic Sciences.
Well, the Institute was founded about 40 years ago by the Apollo 14 astronaut Edgar Mitchell, who was the sixth man to walk on the moon. And as he puts it, on his way back from his moonwalk, he had the window seat. And so here he was in the space capsule watching the moon and the earth and the stars and the moon and the earth and the stars. And he had what he calls an epiphany, where he felt himself as one with everything he was seeing. He had an inner realization that the molecules of his body were the same molecules that were in the stars and the moon and the earth and the space capsule. And it was this experience of oneness and bliss, and people have actually described this experience throughout the ages in wisdom traditions. So when Dr. Mitchell came back to Earth, he wanted to find out what had happened to him, and he was looking for a word that would describe this sense of inner knowing. It was almost like a direct download, rather than learning as he had been taught to learn at MIT and as a Navy pilot. This was something he knew absolutely and fully to be true in the very core of his being, but he didn't have a word for it. So he started to look into the research literature. Not much information there about that kind of experience. Looked into the spiritual literature and found the word samadhi to describe his experience, and knew that that might be a little bit hard to get across to folks. And so he ended up finding the Greek word noetic, which is the form of knowing that is inner. It's your intuitive knowing or your hunches or gut feelings. It's the knowing you have that you might feel in your five senses, but it goes far beyond your five senses. And so he founded the Institute of Noetic Sciences to bring together this inner knowing with science, which is then outer knowing, or forming hypotheses about natural phenomena we observe and testing whether those hypotheses are true through systematic observations and laboratory science.
And what year was that?
That was in 1973. So today we still do science, and we direct the lens of science onto inner experience. And one way I like to describe it is it's almost like the Apollo program for inner space, or if you think about National Geographic, this is the National Geographic of the inner territories. So we consider ourselves explorers into realms that up until now science really hasn't explored very much in depth.
Well, they've specifically excluded it.
Correct,
It's part
yes.
of the whole scientific method is the observer is not really part of the whole experience, even though he's the one having the experience.
Yeah, and often people will say, you know, you can't really study those things. I mean, you can't study those deep inner experiences, and I think that's absolutely inaccurate. We used to think that we couldn't study the genome. We used to think that we couldn't put a man on the moon. And so this is the same kind of thing where we can use scientific methods to study these experiences that are very meaningful for most people. There's something like 60 to 70% of people say that they have had a deep spiritual experience that has changed their life. And so that's the kind of thing we're interested in looking at.
What sort of specific research have you been doing lately?
Well, one realm of our research is in these experiences of transformation. And so, like this experience Edgar had, where he had a complete shift in perspective, a shift in his understanding of who he was and how he was related to the world around him. People have these experiences quite often, actually. Near-death experiences, loss of a loved one, times of deconstruction in someone's life, losing a job or losing a relationship, finding oneself struggling financially or with meaning and purpose, going through
Sometimes when you're backed against the wall.
Yes, yeah. So very often these are the kinds of experiences that cause a profound transformation. And If you're lucky, it's an experience of beauty or awe or wonder, or you meet someone or read a book or have some moment where you say, wait a minute, there is a whole lot more going on here in life than I ever knew before. And some of our subjects have told us, for example, that they felt like up until that time they'd been seeing the world two-dimensionally, but they didn't really know it. And all of a sudden there's this depth perception, and they have a completely different picture of how the world works and what their life is really about. And one of our interviewees told us it's almost like you have a deck of cards and they blow out and fall all over the floor, and when you pick them back up, the priorities that you had in the past, the things that were on the top of the deck are now on the bottom of the deck, and the things that were on the bottom are on the top. So we're looking into these experiences of profound transformation, especially ones that lead people to greater meaning and purpose and empathy, compassion, altruism, and finding their own way of making a contribution to the greater good.
Do you think that tribal societies in general had this sort of awareness more than we modern folk do?
I think that's true in many respects, that they had more of the noetic side of noetic science. Now, they may not have also had the scientific side. So we don't want to make the mistake of romanticizing tribal cultures too much. What we're really trying to say here is that it's about being able to balance the two, the inner knowing with then the rigor and discernment of science, so that we're being thoughtful as we're being open-minded. So it's not being so open-minded that your brain falls out. You're really allowing yourself to access and value multiple ways of knowing, but not discarding the intellectual or the reason or the scientific way of knowing. It's more finding the balance between the two and being able to navigate with agility through both of them.
And where does the ego reside in all of this?
Well, it's a good question. The ego comes up a lot in our studies on transformation, because many people would frame the whole process as transcending the ego. Some people would say it's about minimizing or even demolishing the ego. Others would say, remember we interviewed a Sufi master who said, the ego is like a donkey. We want to ride the ego. We want to train the ego as our servant rather than being sort of the petty tyrant within. And so I think what I've found after these many studies we've done interviewing spiritual masters and teachers across a variety of the world's traditions, and then surveying thousands of people about their experiences of transformation, is that often the results of these studies are kind of paradoxical. On one hand, these practices and pathways and experiences people have really strengthen their egos so that they're much better at doing everything they want to do in the world. And at the very same time, it does kind of dethrone the ego, and it takes us into a place of present moment awareness, so that we're not so much strategizing and planning and being the agents of our own destiny and feeling like I've got to fight the world to make this happen. This is what the ego is kind of good at. It's saying instead, okay, ego, you're pretty good at all this planning and strategizing and getting things together, but what I want to rule the show is my authentic nature, my awareness, and much more of my attention toward what's happening in the present moment than
intuition.
Yes, yeah.
The felt presence of the moment.
Yeah.
Good. And the unconscious? Do you study the unconscious? How does the unconscious come into your studies?
Well, it's interesting because there used to be a lot of talk about the unconscious in the early days of psychology, and now when I go to psychology meetings, the unconscious is almost like a bad word. We're not supposed to talk about the unconscious anymore. That's old-fashioned. But now what they call it is the implicit. In other words, it's the knowledge you have or the habits and behaviors you have without even knowing that you have them. And so now the new word is implicit. But really the process of transformation, positive transformation, appears to be one of making what was unconscious or implicit more conscious. And so it's not so much about getting rid of the things that are kind of down there in the depths and the murky waters, but seeing them clearly and then including them as part of who we are, welcoming them into our kind of particular constellation of resources and experiences, and moving forward as a more whole person.
I know the cognitive neuroscientists are telling us that more and more of the brain functions are unconscious. To me, that does sort of highlight the idea of trusting your intuition, and rather than making a pro and con sheet, just go camping if you have a big decision to make, things like that.
Yeah, and I would say, it's really about, again, honoring the multiple ways that we all have of knowing. So it's not so much discarding the list of pros and cons, but it's saying, make a list of pros and cons, but then spend all day in nature and spend time in silence and in solitude looking within. Use artistic processes and creativity and draw the issue and, weave the issue and swim the issue and dance the issue, and that these are ways of knowing that in our Western culture, in modern times, are not trained, typically. Our children are being raised in an educational system that values the analytic mind almost completely over these other ways of knowing. And it was sort of a reaction to, the Dark Ages and superstition taking us all to a very negative place. So I don't think the answer is to bring back only intuition as the primary way of knowing and get rid of intellect. It's to say, how can we equally access these different ways of knowing so that we can function really more as complete people?
Mm-hmm. And dream analysis, does that come into play too?
Well, many people we interviewed about their transformative processes, and many traditions that we examined use dreams. Almost all of the religious traditions and spiritual traditions at some point mention dreams as tools for us to learn about our own unconscious, or as Carl Jung would have said, to tap into a collective unconscious. Many great innovations and creative leaps have happened in dreams. So there's the great story of the man who was inventing the sewing machine, who was really stuck on how to get the thread through the needle and get the machine to work, and then he had a dream of visiting a tribe, and the spears all had holes in the ends of the spears, and he woke up and said, oh, the hole has to go at the end of the needle. So it being able to work with...
The point of the needle.
Yes, right,
Yeah, right.
So we want to, dreams are just one of many methods of accessing this inner knowing that speak to us often not in linear language, but in symbols and metaphors and imagery.
Good. Now, you co-authored a book called Living Deeply that spells a lot of this out and very succinctly. Would you like to talk about the book?
Sure. The book Living Deeply came from over a decade of research on transformative practices, and it started with one man who was a wealthy businessman who lived in Los Angeles, and he was a very kind of pragmatic guy. And he reached a point in his life where he said, he had this inkling, like I'm not quite seeing everything. I'm not sure I have a great life, I have a great family, I'm highly successful, everything's working, but there's something missing. And so a friend of his took him to a workshop at Esalen, which is on the coastline of California, and he had an experience where he went on the deck and had an experience of feeling himself completely open and be one with everything he saw. So he had this transformative moment, and it changed his life, and he later became one of the first people who was doing micro-lending in third world countries and funding people who were Nobel Peace Prize winners. And so he'd really just started living in a completely different way. And so he came to us and said, I want to find out what happened to me, and I want to make it happen for other people. He's a real businessman, So we started studying it, and what we found was that there is almost no scientific research on these transformative moments, even though they underlie some of the best thinking and the best advancements in our human society. And we started interviewing spiritual teachers, transformative teachers, religious traditions, which is where a lot of this wisdom is held. We surveyed thousands of people about their own transformative experiences and what came from them. And then we did a couple of studies where we actually followed people who were engaging in transformational practices over time to see how those practices unfolded in their lives, things like yoga and meditation and martial arts. And so as a result of all this, we've created a model of the transformative process that is drawing from the commonalities across all these varied traditions and this infinite variety of people's own experiences, whether they're a soldier on the battlefield who has a moment, or someone who works in a soup kitchen, or a parent, or someone who's a school teacher. There's similarities across all these experiences and traditions, and when we look at those similarities, we start to sort of chart a course of how does transformation happen? What are the tools that are the most useful? What are the factors that inhibit it? And what happens as things unfold? And so it was great work. It was really interesting.
So what are the most useful tools?
Well, I'd say the number one thing was having a daily mind-body practice. And the most popular practice that people mentioned was meditation, or some time every day for quiet contemplation, whatever that looked like for that person. So there was the daily mind-body practice. A second factor was having a community of like-minded people who you can talk to about what you experience, even if it seems a little bit crazy, or even if it feels like something that's too vulnerable to share. Having this community of people that can help you understand what's happening with you, and not too like-minded. They also need to be people who are willing to ask questions and say, is that really what you felt? You kind of push you a little bit to go a little further. And so community, daily mind-body practice, and then finding ways to create and express what you've been experiencing. So not just hanging out in your bedroom contemplating all these things, but then saying, what am I going to do in my life that expresses what I'm learning? And that
so you've opened up a piece of your psyche, and you want to keep it open. You want some repetition so you can have that experience.
Yes.
Again, I think that the keeping the epiphany is the hardest part.
Yeah.
You can have a life-changing event, or a potentially life-changing event, but if you can't really work it into your life, then it's just going to be an incredible moment.
That's right, and you see a lot of people chasing those incredible moments over and over and over again without ever really integrating it into their everyday life. And so many of the people we talked to said what they learned was actually it wasn't really about the big fireworks moment at all. It had to do with everything that led up to that and everything that came after it.
Good. How big is your staff?
Well, at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, we have about 30 to 35 people working on staff. We have a 200-acre retreat center that's about an hour north of San Francisco. And we also have a laboratory and research and education center in downtown Petaluma. And between the retreat center and the research and education unit, we do transformational work with people, transformational education. We do basic science, exploring the nature of reality and what is it about these experiences. Is there anything about these experiences that we can actually measure in the laboratory? And then we translate what we find into applications and tools that people can use in their everyday lives. And we provide a community of people who are members of the Institute of Noetic Sciences who support the work and who meet every 2 years in our international conference and come to the retreat center.
How big is your membership?
Well, right now we have about 50,000 people who are part of our online community. And I just love our supporters, because often when people come to the Institute, it's because they wanted to remain thoughtful and analytical, and they didn't want to discard the science or the rational mind, but they felt like limited by not having enough opportunity to bring their soul into whatever they were doing. So we have a lot of teachers and physicians and nurses and psychotherapists, often who don't live in the Bay Area like we do, so they don't have anyone in their whole entire institution that they can talk to about using their gut feelings or hunches to make diagnostic decisions, or having experiences that are maybe a little bit scary even, or disruptive, like how did I know that, or what's going on here. And so when they find the Institute, it becomes a place for them to feel validated and to have a community of people they can talk to about their experience, and then learn more, because we've got a kind of constant increasing amount of information and resources that people can access.
How many times a year do you do retreats?
Well, the retreat center is booked almost full time. So there are people who come to our retreat center who are of like mind, doing transformational work. There are scientists and scholars and universities that come. And then we have our own workshops that are about 8 times a year.
And can you be in residence there? Can you come and stay for a week? Can you stay for a month?
Yeah, it has room for, so the retreat center at the Institute of Noetic Sciences has about 100 sleeping spaces at the moment. And we're in the process now of working toward a future where we become a sustainable model for land-based transformational education. And so we hope at some point that we can have completely zero waste and green and solar, demonstration projects. And so we're working toward that. I think that's an exciting advancement for the retreat center.
Is there a larger goal as far as our collective conscious, as Jung would put it?
Yeah.
As far as the planet and our relationship to the planet?
Yeah, the Institute of Noetic Sciences, our research is based on the idea that our consciousness matters, and what we intend, what we pay attention to, what we believe, our perspective on the world makes a big difference in what happens in our everyday lives. Not just because of how we behave, but also that the attention or intention itself is having an influence on the world around us. And so I think what we're taught through the Western educational model and sort of the materialist paradigm is that it really doesn't matter what you think or what you intend or what you pay attention to. What matters is, this is reality and you can measure it, and what you think is no big deal. So this is
the tyranny of material science.
Yes, material, yeah. And we actually use material means to study whether consciousness does in fact matter. So we have, for example, an experiment where we're looking at the influence of attention on the quantum level. So it's a double-slit optical system where photons are being kind of shot down a tube in a stream. They go through 2 slits, and if the photons are behaving as waves, they'll have an interference pattern on the back wall of our little tube. And if they're behaving as particles, you'll have 2 vertical lines at the end of the tube. And what physicists already know, the quantum measurement problem, is if the system is being observed or if information is being extracted from the system, the photons will behave as particles, and if it's not, they'll behave as waves.
They're virtual particles until they're looked at, and then
That's
they
right.
take shape.
Yeah. So what we're studying is not so much that actual observation using instrumentation or the senses, but seeing if people can use their minds to perceive what's happening in the box. And when they do that, we find that there is increasing collapse of the wave function into particles as though it were being directly perceived. So it's a nice, elegant experiment looking at just the role of consciousness in the physical world.
You also study remote viewing, things like that?
Well, we have many colleagues who have studied remote viewing. Our work has been more in the realm of telepathy or influence on living systems from a distance. So our telepathy experiments have had to do with, say, you've got someone in a room who is given 4 cards, and one of the cards has a picture on them, and so they're going to hold this image in their mind. Someone from a distance is trying to perceive what is the image that person is holding. And we have a whole bunch of papers on the idea that basically people do perceive what's happening at a much bigger level than chance. So when I say much bigger, it doesn't mean that they get it 95% of the time. What I mean is that the odds against chance are quite large, that this would be very difficult odds to get if it were just by chance.
Did they get it 1% of the time?
Well, it's
If they're
different in
very
different
good.
experiments.
I mean, if
yeah.
someone is good at it,
Yeah,
what's a very good?
That's a really good question. I don't know the actual numbers that would be sort of what is the hit rate at which point we say, wow, this is amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're working now on looking at meta-analyses across lots of studies to see what we can see in terms of the patterns. But what I can tell you is, if something should only happen 25% of the time and it happens 30% of the time or 35% of the time, statistically, that's a big deal if you do the experiment correctly. And so we're very dedicated to doing these experiments well and publishing in peer-reviewed journals and following all the rules of science. And even when we do that, there is a lot of resistance in the scientific community to publishing or accepting these results. Recently, we submitted a paper on precognition, where we know when people are presented with a stimulus that should have a reaction. So in this case, it was audio tones or light flashes. So if you see a light flash, your visual cortex lights up. Audio tone, your auditory cortex lights up. And so what we're finding is that there seems to be a few hundred milliseconds before the stimulus where the correct aspect of the brain lights up. And so the way we currently understand how time works and perception works, this should not be able to happen, that there's some increase in arousal before the stimulus. So we conducted experiments and wrote up the results and submitted it to a journal. And we basically got a review saying this is very good. It solves a lot of the problems of previous research in this area. It's well designed, and if it were on a different topic and had different findings, we'd be happy to publish it.
Yeah, how do you break through? I guess you have to figure that out. That's maybe the hardest part.
Yeah, I think that's the question of paradigm shift is very important to us at IONS. And so in this instance, we're talking about scientific paradigm shift. And the paradigm is not so much, hey, believe all this stuff happens. The first paradigm shift is believe it's allowed to be studied.
That's right.
It's okay to look into it. You
get a
can
beachhead into
actually,
their unconscious so that
that's right.
they
Yeah.
can start dwelling on it.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is, I give lectures all over the country, and our scientists give lectures all over the world, and so, there'll be a lot of resistance and sort of like, skepticism and even some real hostility. Like, you are damaging the field of science by doing these studies, and yet the sessions we are giving will be standing room only in the most popular session in the place. So, people are very interested, partly because it's controversial, but partly because there are so many people out there who know that something is not exactly right about the way we understand reality. And let's hope not, because number one, we're not doing incredibly well necessarily in solving problems like inequity of resources or destruction of the planet and extinction of species and violent conflict. But also just because we know for sure there's no way we could have a perfectly correct theory now about how everything works. So that's what we do at IONS, is look at anomalies that give the lie to how we currently understand the way reality works. And we shine a spotlight on those anomalies and create experiments to see if we can find out more about our human potential and the nature of reality by studying them.
Good. Well, Dr. Vieten, it sounds like you're doing very good work. Thank you for coming and telling us about the Institute, and I hope you'll come back and we can focus on individual topics in more detail.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, very good, thank you. And thank you for joining us. Good night.